This is Detective Explainer. Today I'm going to explain a sensual thriller film called Unfaithful. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. It's a very windy day in the suburbs. It's quietly chaotic, but Connie Sumner has her house all under control. She makes sure that her cheeky and overactive son, Charlie, and her loving jokester of a husband, Edward, are well taken care of. Life is good for the sub-nurses and Connie's content. The winds remain strong throughout the day, and just about everyone's struggling against it, including Connie. After failing to hail a taxi, she accidentally bumps into an equally struggling Frenchman named Paul Martel, who's carrying a big pile of books. Connie falls on top of him, and she immediately apologizes. Despite his frustration, he helps and fails to get her a cab. So, Paul curses before joking briefly with Connie. Noticing her scraped legs, Paul motions for his nearby apartment and invites her inside so she can treat her wounds. After a moment of hesitation, Connie follows along. It's surprisingly spacious for an apartment in Soho, and the bohemian-esque place has literal walls and mazes of books in it, since Paul's a book dealer. When Connie finishes treating her wounds, Paul offers her some tea. But instead of accepting it, she asks to use his phone. Connie calls Charlie, and as she talks to him, Paul places an ice-filled washcloth upon her thigh. Smiling, he guides her free hand to hold onto it, and Connie stammers, clearly put off by the intimacy of the situation. But Connie doesn't say anything about it, and after the call, she tells Paul that was her son. Finally, Paul introduces himself, and Connie learns he's 27. Before Connie leaves, Paul insists that she takes home a book. At his instruction, Connie takes one and flips to a specific page. She reads the poem aloud, and Paul joins her in reciting. Be happy for this moment is your life. At home, Connie explains to Edward what happened to her legs, and that some nice guy gave her some bandages and put her in a cab. Edward teasingly asks if he's handsome, and if she got his name so they can send him some. The next day, in Grand Central Station, Connie calls Paul to thank him for helping her, but Paul talks over her and invites her to his apartment instead. Despite her hesitation, Connie agrees. At Paul's residence, he greets Connie with the same boyishly dry humor of his, and he invites her in. As he takes her coat off, he makes sure to let his fingers brush against her skin. Then, in another attempt to stay skin to skin, Paul asks Connie to close her eyes. He gingerly holds her hand, guiding it over his braille book. They laugh at the book's contents, but even when their laughter dies down, Paul still has his hands on Connie's, and he links his fingers with hers. When he does this, a still smiling Connie says she has to go, then leaves. Afterwards, she heads straight to Edward's office, where she briefly greets an employee named Bill. When he's gone, the content and ever-happy couple share a tight and loving hug. Though there's no occasion, Connie hands Edward a gift, which is a sweater that makes him look like Bill Gates. Though Edward's clearly busy and facing some problems with his armored truck business, he still makes time for Connie and urges her to stay. He asks her what she was up to that day, and when Connie says she was doing stuff for the auction, Edward asks her who she hit on. Tense, Connie responds with Bob Gaylord, and Edward jokes about the man. Edward notices that Connie is a little distracted as she washes the dishes, but he doesn't comment on it. She ends up meeting with Paul in his apartment again, and he invites her to dance with him. A spell seems to take over her, as she loses herself in the dance and in the intensity of her moment with Paul. She asks him how many girlfriends he's had, and he playfully answers, 2. Connie lets her hands roam his body, and when their lips are just inches away from each other, the music skips. The spell is broken for Connie, and with regret and confusion washing over her, she says that this is a mistake. Paul retorts that there is no mistake, just things you can and can't do, and Connie decides that she can't do this before walking away. But just seconds later she returns, clearly distressed since she forgot her coat. Without another word, Paul sweeps Connie off her feet, and she wraps her arms around his neck, defeated by her strong attraction to him. Later, Connie's in a train, stewing in both regret and incredulousness. But amidst all this, she gives a pained and conflicted smile, her face contorting in guilt as she remembers what happened. Paul knew just what to do with her body, but Connie's still having second thoughts. What really broke her inhibitions, though, was when Paul told her to hit him. That coaxed a certain passion out of Connie, and she was soon hitting and biting him feverishly. Paul enjoyed her fire, her feistiness, and the two of them went past the point of no return. As Edward goes on with his day, he comes across Bob Gaylord, the man who Connie supposedly hounded for some money for the auctions the other day. When Edward jokingly tells him to watch out for Connie, Bob's confused, not knowing what he's talking about. Bob tells Edward that he's been out of town, leaving Edward to make sense of what he just said. Over the next few days, Connie finds herself embracing her double life. When with Eddie and Charlie, she's happy and content. When she's with Paul, she's thrilled and pleasured, and they continue to explore the different ways they can keep pleasuring each other, even if it's through a little pain. One time, Paul takes Connie to a restaurant. Unbeknownst to her, Edward's employee, Bill, is also there, and he catches them making out. Though her intimate life with Paul is flourishing, the same can't be said for hers and Edward's, as she keeps rejecting his advances. One morning, Edward pulls all the stops to try and have lunch with her, but Connie makes excuses after excuses. He eventually gives up when she says that she has an appointment for a facial soon. At work, Edward calls the beauty salon to see if Connie really made the appointment. She never did. While on her way to Paul's apartment, Connie gets stopped in the street by her acquaintances and Sally. Despite her protests, Tracy convinces her to go to a cafe with them. There she heads for the telephone and calls Paul, asking him to wait for her since she's stuck there. It doesn't take long before Paul shows up, and as he heads to the restrooms, Connie excuses herself. The two sloppily hook up in the restroom, and Connie comes back to their table afterwards like nothing happened. When Paul goes to the counter, Sally says that she'd give herself to him if he just Tracy sharply chides her, reminding her of her kids and husband. But Sally nonchalantly retorts that having an affair can just be like a pottery class to her, something to broaden her horizons with. The atmosphere on the table grows tense, with Tracy taking on a more somber demeanor. Knowingly, she warns Tracy and Connie that having an affair is just a disaster waiting to happen. When Tracy falls silent, the woman realizes that she too had an affair. And with regret clear in her face and voice, Tracy asserts that if there's one thing in her life she wants to undo, it would be that. The solemn conversation weighs heavily on Connie, and when she's back in Paul's apartment, she proposes that they can just end their relationship now before anyone gets hurt. Without missing a beat, Paul gets close to Connie and tells her that he'll be the one who'll get hurt if they end it now. At work, Edward confronts Bill about his disloyalty to the company and promptly fires him. Distraught, Bill tries to reason that he has a family, and Edward only retorts that he had a family there at work. Something in Bill snaps upon hearing that, and he walks away from Edward, but not without snapping that he doesn't know a single thing about family and that Edward should take a look at his own first before preaching. Edward watches him with a lost look on his face. Later, he hires a private investigator named Frank to tail his wife. Edward has to leave for Chicago the next day, and Connie doesn't even see him off. Instead, she just pretends to be asleep until he leaves. With Edward gone, Connie and Paul become more brazen with their meetings, and they even hook up in a movie theater. But unbeknownst to them, Frank is following them, taking their pictures. Later, Frank shows Edward, Connie, and Paul's photos. He gives him a rundown of his wife's affair, from who Paul is and how long they stay together. Edward is heartbroken, devastated even, and he can only riffle through the photos in complete silence. At this point, Connie is just hanging on a thread, haunted by the impending disaster that she's carved by her own hand. She's more absent-minded now, messes up her housework, and almost forgets to pick Charlie up from school. She bursts into tears in a grocery store, then in her car, and she drives and swerves recklessly in the rain. While driving, she sees Paul happily running off with some other woman. She follows them to a bookstore and attacks Paul while demanding to know who the woman is. Paul takes a very bitter Connie back to his apartment. The tension between the two is palpable, and with the intense wave of emotions flooding her, Connie aggressively breaks things off with him. But Paul refuses to let her go, and he keeps kissing, touching, and undressing her while Connie keeps fighting and telling him she hates him. But in the end, the two roughly makes love while Edward is outside Paul's apartment, just watching it. Later, a very disheveled Connie hurriedly leaves the apartment, and she doesn't notice that Edward's there. After hesitating, Edward heads inside, and he goes up to knock on Paul's apartment. The moment Paul answers the door and comes face to face with him, the first question that the initially speechless Edward asks is, "How old is he?" Then he politely introduces himself as Connie's husband and asks a now weary Paul if he can come in. Their conversation is stiff and awkward, and the air around them is oppressive. Paul tries to dispel the tension by drinking some vodka with Edward, while Edward tries to stay casual as he politely asks Paul how he is, how he met Connie, and if she likes this neighborhood. Paul says she probably finds the city more exciting than the suburbs. Gathering himself, Edward explains that Charlie's the reason why they left the city, since Connie thought the suburbs would be better for him. This is news to Paul, who muses that Connie said it was Edward's idea. Taken aback, Edward stammers, asking Paul if they talk about him. Paul doesn't answer, and Edward continues to his bedroom, with Paul following behind him. There's something broken in Edward's eyes as he stares at Paul's messy bed. The excruciating moment drags on, and Edward finds a snow globe among Paul's things. He fiddles with it, and it starts playing a tune. Edward is shattered, and after Paul uncomfortably confirms that it's a gift from Connie, he sits down on the bed, a feeling of weakness crashing into him. With a heavy and miserable sigh, Edward reveals that the Windy City snow globe was his gift to Connie. Edward breaks down in tears, confused and betrayed. The devastation swallows him whole, and everything becomes jarry and blurry to him. He keeps saying that he's not feeling well, and the concerned Paul approaches him, asking if he needs some water. Without thinking, Edward suddenly bashes the snow globe against Paul's head, and the blunt force kills him instantly. Edward is disoriented as he falls back to the bed. He's still unwell, and things only fully click when he spots the blood on the snow globe. A strangled cry leaves him as he sees the blood on his hands. Then he quickly goes on to clean the scene of the crime. Suddenly, Edward hears Connie leave a voice message. She tearfully breaks it off with Paul and says that she's tired of living this way, of hurting and lying to her family. Edward wills himself to move, and he wraps Paul's body in a carpet. Before leaving, he erases all of Paul's voice messages. He drags Paul out of the apartment and into the hood of his car. After attending Charlie's play and making sure that Connie is asleep at night, he takes his car and dumps Paul's body in a landfill. The next day, Edward looks even worse for wear, and Connie notices this, but he insists that he is okay. Almost desperately, Edward asks Connie if she likes it there and promises that they can move out if she wants. Concerned, Connie assures him that they're not moving out. Later, the police shows up at the Sumner residence to ask Connie about Paul, since her number was found at his desk. Detective Dean and Detective Moronic asks her if she knows where Paul is, as his family reported him as missing, and his wife doesn't know where he is. Stunned, Connie says that she doesn't know he had a wife, and Dean clarifies that they're separated. Connie pleads ignorance about his whereabouts, saying that he's just a book dealer she was planning to buy from, and with that, the men leave. At a birthday party, Charlie tells Edward about the cops. Both Edward and Connie play it cool, and Connie pretends that she hardly knows the missing man at all. Try as Edward may to feign normalcy, he is repeatedly haunted by the memory of what he did to Paul, no matter where he is. A week and a half later, detectives return to the Sumner residence. Dean reveals that Paul's body was found on the weekend, and Connie painstakingly maintains her composure after hearing the news. Though Dean clearly thinks that Connie is closer to Paul than she lets on, they leave after some futile questioning. Edward quietly leaves Connie too, and as soon as he's gone, she breaks down in tears. At a laundry place, Connie discovers that Edward's jacket has something in it. Upon checking, Connie's world comes crashing when she finds photos of her and Paul there. That night, the Summers have their friends over. The people in the living room chatter on, while Connie can hardly focus on anything. Eventually, her guests catches her attention when she looks through their snow globe collection. To Connie's horror, she sees the windy snow globe that she gave Paul, the snow globe that Edward killed him with. Breathing heavily, Connie looks towards Edward, who struggles to even meet her gaze. Edward and Connie finally unravel when the guests are gone. Connie confronts him, asking him what he did, and when Edward's had enough, he asserts that she should be the one telling him what she did. How she screwed Paul over and over, how she lied to him over and over. In his anger, Edward starts going on about how Connie threw everything away just for some kid. And he even asked her if she really thought that he wouldn't realize, because how couldn't he? He knew Connie, and from day one that something was amiss. Finally, Edward blows up and tells Connie that he hates her, that he didn't want to kill Paul, he wanted to kill her. With everything out in the open, the agonizing realization that her husband is a murderer suffocates Connie, and she sounds like she's going to be sick. She walks away from him, and Edward falls apart. Morning comes peacefully, with Charlie and Edward quietly playing the piano together, and Connie looking through their family album. Edward relishes in that serene moment with his son, and he stops for a while just to hold Charlie closer. Then, police sirens can be heard from outside. Charlie is oblivious while his parents share a tense look, until Edward resumes with playing the piano. Connie takes the Windy City snow globe and fiddles with it. She plays the tune, but it sounds stuck, so she opens the globe. Inside, she finds a small envelope that reads, "If found, do not open until our 25th anniversary," which Edward wrote in 1993. She looks towards Edward, who's also watching her, then opens the envelope to reveal a photograph of them with baby Charlie. Behind the photograph, Edward wrote, "To my beautiful wife, the best part of every day." Edward and Connie then shared a pained look with a piano filling the empty silence. Later, Connie tearfully burns all of the photos that Frank took of her and Paul. She thinks back to when Paul first invited her to his apartment, but in her imagination, Connie doesn't accept his offer and instead hails a cab. They would part ways with a smile. Paul would still be alive. Edward approaches her, and when Connie tells him she's scared, he says that he'll turn himself in. She immediately rejects the idea. And as Edward sits beside her and holds her, she promises him that no one will know. To this, Edward simply says, "We'll know." Connie leans into him and cries. Despite their attempts at normalcy, the knowledge of what they've done continues to haunt the Subners, even as time passes. During a dance, Edward and Connie can't even kiss each other no matter how much they try. The guilt and agony culminate, while they drive and stop at a red light. With Charlie asleep, Connie starts talking about leaving the country, starting anew. And with Edward's playfulness showing through again, he calls her señorita, which prompts Connie to bring up Mexico. She continues, saying they can live near a beach and learn the guitar, and Edward promises to serenade her every night until she falls asleep. Finally, Connie asks Edward what he thinks, and he simply tells her that it sounds perfect. Defeated, Connie weeps and Edward holds her close so they can kiss and hold each other. But the light turns green, and it is revealed that their car is parked just outside a police station. Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.